Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily News for Wednesday, February 23rd. We start the newscast in Ottawa, where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has revoked the use of the Emergencies Act. The Prime Minister made the announcement today at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. On Monday, Mr. Trudeau said the time-limited extraordinary powers granted by the Emergencies Act were still needed because his government was worried about blockades returning. The Prime Minister now says that order has been restored, and that while threats remain, police and existing legislation will be enough to prevent other occupations. All right, moving to the response to Russian aggression against Ukraine. Canada is sending an additional 460 troops to Eastern Europe, including a 100-soldier artillery unit to Latvia. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the frigate HMCS Halifax and a CP-140 Aurora patrol plane are also being deployed to Eastern Europe, all by the end of March. The Prime Minister also announced what he described as a first round of sanctions against Russia. This included banning any financial dealings with the eastern Ukrainian regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. Mr. Trudeau will be attending a virtual G7 leaders meeting on Thursday to discuss the situation. Meanwhile, bail was not granted yesterday in Ottawa for two jailed organizers of the Freedom Convoy protests. A judge rejected bail for Tamara Leach, feeling she had been disingenuous in court on Saturday. And the judge was also unconvinced that Ms. Leach would go home and not re-offend if released. Another key organizer, Mr. Patrick King, won't find out until Friday if he will get bail. Both organizers face mischief charges, but Mr. King faces more, including counseling to commit mischief and counseling to obstruct police. Well, this comes as an MPP who attended the Ottawa occupation is facing backlash from the Ontario legislature, which has unanimously passed a motion authorizing the Speaker to bar independent MPP Randy Hillier from participating in the chamber. The politician from Eastern Ontario recently supported and attended the Ottawa anti-vaccine mandate protests, and he has frequently posted COVID-19 misinformation and conspiracy theories online. The motion calls on Mr. Hillier to apologize for what Government House Leader Paul Calandra calls racist and discriminatory statements about the federal transport minister, and for social media posts that Mr. Calandra says were insinuating a call to violence. Moving to the ongoing search for answers after a violent attack last Thursday on a coastal GasLink work camp outside of Houston. The RCMP is asking for the public's help in identifying the roughly 20 people involved. The Mounties have released 3 short video clips which show parts of the attack. Police previously estimated the damage to be in the multi-million-dollar range, saying attackers smashed vehicles, confronted workers, and set traps along the forest road leading to the camp. Well, it looks like the prairies continue to face freezing temperatures this week. Extreme cold warnings were in effect on Wednesday morning from Environment Canada for most of Alberta, all of Saskatchewan, and most of Manitoba and northern Ontario. A bitterly cold Arctic air mass produced extreme wind chills of -40 or worse this morning. A Toronto-based mining company says sanctions being imposed by Western and European countries against Russia won't stop it from hitting gold. Kinross Gold says its operations at a mine in the northeastern part of the country won't be affected. It says it has successfully operated in Russia for more than 25 years and has managed to deal with similar situations. The company is estimating about 13% of its 2022 global production will come from Russia. All right, turning to Canada's airline industries that are looking to go green. A consortium of 60 airlines operating in Canada, along with airports, research institutions, and jet fuel producers and refiners, has launched a new organization aimed at spurring development of sustainable aviation fuel. Advocates say the technology is the airline industry's best shot at reducing its GHG emissions. The Canadian Council for Sustainable Aviation Fuels will develop targets and a strategy for a made-in-Canada sustainable aviation fuel industry. Back in Ottawa, officials are offering help to a group of First Nations in Saskatchewan to search for the unmarked graves of children who went missing at 2 residential schools. The Battle Fords Agency Tribal Chiefs Organization has been told by the federal government that it would spend $2.8 million over 3 years to support research into what happened at the Battleford Industrial and Thunderchild residential schools. The government says 107 deaths were recorded at the Battleford Industrial School, while 44 deaths were recorded at Thunderchild. All right, stay with us. We'll be right back shortly after a break with a detailed look at long COVID and what exactly it means. We'll be speaking with Dr. Abhishek Raut, the medical director at Apple Tree Medical Group, about this when we return. So stay with us. We'll be right back on Forum Daily News. Experts say it's too early to know whether people infected with the Omicron variant will develop long COVID. But many doctors believe it is possible to have long-term effects from Omicron. Long COVID is usually diagnosed many weeks after someone gets sick with COVID-19. Overall, some estimates suggest more than a third of COVID-19 survivors will develop some symptoms of long COVID. Scientists are racing to figure out what's behind this mysterious condition and whether vaccines could be part of the answer. Meanwhile, a peer-reviewed paper published in BMJ's Archives of Disease in Childhood Journal has defined the term long COVID for children in particular. Well, joining us now to tell us more about long COVID is Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, we've been hearing a lot about long COVID throughout the pandemic. So what have we learned so far about it?
Well, long COVID has a cluster of different symptoms. The most common symptoms reported are fatigue, malaise after exertion, and cognitive problems or brain fog. Many have also said they've suffered insomnia, other sleep issues, heart palpitations, rapid heart rate, muscle aches, joint pain, shortness of breath, dizziness, and vertigo. Other research has also showed that COVID survivors have been found to suffer heart disease and other serious ailments, such as stroke, months after they were first infected.
Some very concerning information there, Dr. Raut. Now, how do the findings in this recent paper on long COVID in children compare to how long COVID affects adults?
That's a good question. A large study of children and young people who caught COVID has found that as many as 1 in 7 may still have symptoms after 15 weeks. This figure, however, is lower than some studies that are reporting a prevalence of long COVID as high as 51% in children and young people. Luckily, we know that both acute COVID and long COVID seems to be less severe in children and adolescents than in adults. In children, we saw a short-term increase in primary care after COVID, and this increase was there for up to 6 months, especially for children aged 1 to 5 years.
All right, Dr. Raut, so how likely is someone to develop long COVID after contracting the virus?
Well, the Journal of the American Medical Association showed that COVID survivors suffer both short and long-term difficulties. So after 6 months of diagnosis or discharge, more than half, or 54%, were still struggling with at least one symptom of long COVID. The American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation now runs models that assumes 30% of the population has some kind of post-acute long COVID symptom.
And although we don't know if Omicron causes long COVID, are there any variants that have been connected to this condition?
What we're noticing is that long COVID is associated with disease severity. So as disease severity increases, so does the risk of all these cardiovascular complications in the long run. So what we're seeing is if it's related to disease severity, the variants related to disease severity are at the greatest risk, especially the Delta variant.
All right, Dr. Raut, so what is still to be known about long COVID?
I think there's a lot we still need to learn about long COVID. The biggest question is why? Why does it happen? We don't see this magnitude in long-term symptoms with influenza or other viruses. So the reason behind that is still puzzling. And the second question is, how long will it last? So far, we have data talking about symptoms for 6 months, maybe 12 months, but does it go even longer? So quite a few questions here.
And so should Canadians be worried about long COVID and its impact in the long run, especially coming out of the pandemic, Dr. Raut?
I think it does change the likelihood of risk for a variety of conditions. Compared to those who were never infected, people who had a COVID infection were more likely to have symptoms, including heart disease, heart failure, dysrhythmia, heart attacks, strokes, and clotting. So very severe conditions there. People with prior COVID-19 infections were more than 60% likely to develop any cardiac issue after. So very life-threatening and very concerning.
Very concerning indeed, Dr. Raut. Just about a minute left here, but how do you see long COVID impacting society as we recover from this pandemic?
That's a very good question. So let's assume that our models show what the American models show, which is 30% of Canadians who've had COVID will have some degree of long COVID. That means in Canada, that's almost 1 million people who may have long COVID. So the pandemic will certainly leave in its wake many people with lasting symptoms and illness. And this, of course, poses an enormous future challenge for healthcare everywhere. So we certainly need more research to find the cause and damage of long COVID and prepare to treat it in all its manifestations.
Dr. Abhishek Raut, always great having you in our medical segments. Thank you again, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right, coming up after the break, we'll be further examining the current situation in Ukraine. We'll be speaking with James Brooke from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He suggests that Russia's military action in Georgia in 2008 could be a blueprint for what is happening today. Very interesting. So we'll speak with him after the break on Forum Daily News. Stay tuned. Ukraine is urging its citizens to leave Russia. Ukraine's lawmakers have approved a nationwide state of emergency beginning on Thursday as fears of a Russian invasion increase. Meanwhile, Moscow has started evacuating personnel from its embassy in Ukraine. Hopes for a diplomatic way out of the crisis appear all but sunk as Washington and key European allies accuse Moscow of crossing a red line. This for rolling over Ukraine's border into separatist regions. The situation remains fluid and uncertain, but one expert suggests that there may be a precedent to learn from. Jim Brooke, writing for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, says Russian action in Georgia in 2008 may be the blueprint for what is happening in Ukraine today. Mr. Brooke previously was Canadian bureau chief of the New York Times and senior positions that he has held with Bloomberg and Voice of America. He is currently a visiting fellow at the FDD, and he joins us now. Mr. Brooke, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima. I appreciate it.
Now, all eyes are on this developing situation, but you say we should look to the past and draw similarities from Russian moves in Georgia in 2008. So tell us a little bit more about what happened back then.
Right. The first week of August in 2008, I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, watching Russian TV, which you could get then, and I saw these hysterical TV correspondents reporting that civilians were being evacuated from the capital of South Ossetia. The civilians looked very relaxed. They looked like they were going to summer camp, and they probably were. But basically, the Russia propaganda machine was starting in action. It coincided with the end of military maneuvers just north of the Georgian border. At the end of those maneuvers, the Russians left 1,000 pieces of equipment, trucks, tanks, armored personnel carriers, right at the northern end of this tunnel through the mountains that goes down into Georgia. I don't know whether the CIA was asleep that weekend or what, but they didn't really get the message through. The sessions are backed by the Russians, started shelling in a very provocative way, killing about 15 Georgian police officers and soldiers. And then finally, the president of Georgia fell for the bait and attacked the secessionists, and then the Russians pounced. And we now know that back about 4 months earlier, they had already prepared a battle plan. And the trigger was the US decision, along with Canada and other countries in NATO, to invite Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. And that set off the Russians immediately. They decided this is our time to act. And they did. So the whole thing was being made up. And at the same time, the Russian president accused the Georgians of genocide, of killing thousands of South Ossetians. In reality, 5 months after the war, the official Russian death toll was 168. So the Russian president said genocide, all the Russian reporters repeated that, and that created a very ugly situation, similar to the Balkans, where the locals supported the purging of Georgian villages, burning them out. It was very, very ugly.
Sounds very similar to the situation developing in Ukraine, sir. So what were the political and military results of Russia's actions against Georgia?
Well, in the case of Georgia, in the long run, you don't lose a war and stay in power. In the long run, the president of Georgia lost power, and Russia kind of got their way. They got a more compliant, more Russia-friendly Prime Minister Bidzina Ivanishvili, and I think that's what they would like in Ukraine. They would like to get a compliant pro-Russian president in power without going through elections, which they can't win.
Well, it seems that Western allies do not want this to happen, and we're seeing sanctions being pushed upon Russia by the U.S., by Canada. But what are the effects that these sanctions are likely going to have on Russia's moves?
Nima, the big surprise this week was Germany, where they have a new untested chancellor, Olaf Scholz. And seemingly out of the blue, he announced that he was stopping Nord Stream 2, which is a 1,000-kilometer Russia to Germany Baltic pipeline that runs along the bed of the Baltic Sea. And that was going to mainstream natural gas into Germany and turn Germany into the Northern European gas hub for Europe, and bypass Ukraine. And so Ukraine, which earns billions of dollars through shipping gas, would be out of the picture. There's a lot of pushback on that. Your prime minister, the American president, pushed back against that pipeline. But the German chancellor took measures that this thing is not supposed to happen.
Definitely. We'll have to keep our eyes on this developing situation as it unfolds. But Mr. Brooks, we are out of time. We'll definitely have to get you back on the show to talk more on this. Thank you again for today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
We'll be right back. As Canada, the U.S., many European and other Western allies level sanctions against Russia, China has a different take on the crisis. China is accusing the U.S. of creating fear and panic and of fueling tensions by providing defensive weapons to Ukraine. Without mentioning Russia's deployment of as many as 190,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, a Chinese foreign ministry spokeswoman says China is opposed to the sanctions on Russia and is calling for talks to cool things down. The presidents of both countries met for talks earlier this month. There, they backed each other's positions on opposing a NATO expansion in former Soviet republics and supporting China's claim to Taiwan. Meanwhile, Germany's top security official says authorities are preparing for possible cyber attacks in response to the crisis with Russia. German security agencies have taken measures to avert such attacks, and its National Cyber Defense Center is monitoring developments. Meanwhile, the Baltic states are urging world leaders to move swiftly to impose sanctions on Russia. They say their countries know firsthand of the dangers of trying to appease a bully. Latvia's minister said failure to stop Russia's president now would send the message that Moscow can play around with Europe and the U.S. Well, this comes as the U.S. deals with tensions within its own capital. The Pentagon has approved the deployment of 700 unarmed National Guard troops to Washington, D.C., as the U.S. Capitol prepares for trucker convoys bent on protesting pandemic restrictions beginning next week. Calling themselves the People's Convoy, they were inspired by the Canadian Freedom Convoy protest. One group has gathered in California and has begun the journey to Washington today. The National Guard troops will be used to assist with traffic control. Turning to Greece now, where authorities say a Coast Guard vessel fired warning shots at a Turkish fishing boat. It happened during a confrontation in Greek waters near the eastern Aegean Sea island of Chios. The shipping ministry said Wednesday that the Turkish vessel refused to leave Greek waters and had attempted to ram a Greek patrol boat before the shots were fired. No one was injured. The incident comes amid renewed tension between Greece and Turkey over a long-standing dispute over sea boundaries. Meanwhile, a political boundary has been crossed by China, as Japan has lodged a strong protest and demanded an apology after its diplomat was detained and questioned in Beijing. The foreign ministry says the diplomat from the Japanese embassy was seized while on duty and held for several hours on Monday. It said the detention violated the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. In Beijing, the foreign ministry spokesperson told reporters that China has lodged a complaint with Japan, urging it to respect China's law and strictly restrain its consular staff. He said the diplomat had engaged in activities inconsistent with their capacity in China, and authorities questioned him in accordance with the law. In West Africa, the Islamic State group says its fighters have made successive attacks on Nigeria's northeast, killing and wounding dozens of Nigerian soldiers. In a statement on Tuesday, IS claimed that more than 30 Nigerian soldiers were either killed or wounded in Borno State. The Nigeria military reported killing several extremists and recovering a large cache of weapons and vehicles on Monday. The Islamic State in West Africa province is a breakaway faction of the Boko Haram extremist group. It has worked to consolidate power in northeast Nigeria and the surrounding region. In the east coast of Africa, Cyclone Imnati is the fourth cyclone to hit the island of Madagascar in the last month. It crashes into the southeastern coast of the island early this morning, ripping roofs off houses and raising fears of floods and food shortages. The UN Weather Agency says the cyclones are underlining how climate change may be affecting weather patterns and putting lives at risk in vulnerable places like Madagascar. A small Polynesian country is finally able to reconnect to the internet after 5 weeks of disconnection. Tonga's main internet link was disrupted when a huge volcanic eruption and tsunami cut a crucial undersea cable. The fiber optic cable was finally reconnected yesterday and is now operating again. A lot of Canadians have turned to crafts to deal with the stresses of pandemic life over the past 2 years. The president of the American Art Therapy Association believes in the mental health benefits of getting creative. He says a lot of crafts have a repetitive, meditative quality to them that can be very soothing. Dr. Jeremy Nobel of the Harvard Medical School says crafting can be anything that activates your creative impulses and engages our imagination. All right, that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website or follow us on social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.